We've got Teddy Goff, who's coming up. He is founder of Precision Partners, and he's going to be picking apart Biden's recent election victory and seeing what we can learn from that. So over to you, Teddy.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks all for tuning in. I have to say, I used to give a lot of talks prior to the pandemic. This is actually my first Zoom talk, so I hope I get the energy level right. And most importantly, I hope I don't get an embarrassing notification on my screen as I'm sharing it. So I only have a few minutes here. There's no way I can possibly pick apart the entire Biden effort or all the complexity and utter insanity of American politics. What I want to actually do is focus primarily on design and what the campaign's design choices say about their strategy and ultimately, I think, the now Biden administration's governing ideology. And I am not a graphic designer by trade, so I hope I don't make a fool of myself. So first, I want to start by quoting Joe Biden's announcement speech when he got into the race for president. He said, "Discontent over the failure of our political system is rampant throughout our citizenry, and bluntly, it is in this gathering of discontent that my candidacy intends to find its voice. For ultimately, success will be measured not by personal victory, but by our efforts to heal this discontent among our fellow citizens." Now, I'm guessing that some of you may have caught on to what I'm doing here. This is actually a line from Joe Biden's announcement speech from when he ran for president in 1988. So fast forward 30 years, I'm going to quote a smart friend of mine. Some of you may know him, a Republican turned Democrat turned journalist named Tim Miller, who says, in November of 2017, that's fully 30 years after Joe Biden launched his 1988 campaign in 1987 for president, Biden did an interview during which he laid out what a campaign that he didn't exactly want to run would be premised on. It was a message as one about how a certain set of ideals tether us together as Americans, and that above all else, character counts. And Tim says, this was not the prevailing view about the state of the country or the path to victory among the other Democratic candidates, strategists, or left-wing pundits. Biden was derided for his obliviousness and naivete when he would bang on about bipartisanship. Yet when he launched his campaign, he was undeterred, calling the unity doubters out explicitly, saying, "I know some of the smart folks say Democrats don't want to hear about unity. The angrier a candidate can be, the better chance they have to win the nomination. I don't believe it. I really don't. I believe Democrats want to unify this nation." And so, this is the message that he carried forward with him throughout the campaign and even into his inaugural address. When he launches, "We are in a battle for the soul of this nation." First campaign speech, soul of the nation, unite the nation, the DNC, the victory speech, even the inaugural address talking about the battle for the soul of the nation, unity, unity, unity. The same things over the course of a 2-year campaign that he'd been saying for a 30, even 40-year career in public life. And so back to graphic design. It was in that spirit, I think, presumably, that they rolled out a logo that's about as sort of plain and patriotic, red, white, and blue as American political logos get. This logo was actually sort of made fun of in the design community, as you may remember. Nothing about it screams that this is going to be an innovative campaign or a particularly youth-oriented campaign or just sort of a flexible campaign at all. And I think a lot of the stuff you saw in the early days of the Biden campaign was sort of consistent with that, general aesthetic. Lots of red, white, and blue. A lot of the fonts had serifs. Lots of sort of stately, Joe Biden as leader, Americana look. So it might have been a little surprising to you if you were watching the campaign as I was when you started seeing a different kind of design aesthetic coming out of the campaign, stuff like this. And all of this is from the campaign. This is not crowdsourced or influencer stuff. I'll get to influencers a bit later. This is from the Biden for President headquarters team. You can see that they took that tagline, "The battle for the soul of the nation," and made it into a funny little spinny, I think deliberately pixelated GIF at the top of the screen. You see these pinks. They did an event with Lady Gaga, turned out something that looks like it could have been an actual sort of concert poster made by a concert promoter. And it wasn't just the sort of celebrity fun stuff. Even when they're talking about their voter assistance hotline on the right of the screen, you see these stretchy fonts, these gradients. They're obviously having a lot of fun with this. And Fast Company did an article after the campaign about this approach, and they interviewed Biden's absolutely amazing head of design, a woman named Robin Canner, who said, and the article says, "The gradients, lovingly referred to as luscious gradients by Biden's 25-person design team, were meant to counter the feelings of seclusion and isolation born of the pandemic. Cantor said. I think isolation is a very big thing that happened over the last year, and there's a fundamental warmth to gradients that beats flat color. Basically, I wanted everything to have a feel and a life, a luscious quality to it, she says. Now, here's the point I want to make. I think Robin is being a bit modest. I think they were doing something a little bit more than just trying to give you something luscious to sort of brighten up your pandemic sadness. I think what they were really doing was showing people that they had a place in his campaign, showing people that Joe Biden could helm a broader coalition than you might have thought. Even if you didn't vote for him in the primary, even if you weren't inclined to vote for Democrats in the general election. And that, I think, and telegraphing that, I think, served an even larger strategic point for a guy who campaigned on unity. His very visual system suggested that there could be some common cause between red, white, and blue and pink and purple gradients. And if there could be room for that much flexibility in their design system, maybe there could be room for different kinds of people in his campaign, and maybe there could be a way forward through the political mess in America in this idea of unity. And I think that's the core lesson that I take from the campaign, and hopefully that can be a little bit useful for those of you who are listening, that there's a way to be both true to your values and to your brand and find new expressions of that brand, that those two ideas aren't in conflict, that in fact, finding new expressions of your brand may be the best way to be true to it, because there's a certain dishonesty, isn't there, in rigidity? You know, a really rigid, inflexible brand is trying to deny that times change and that people contain multitudes and that companies do different kinds of things and employ different kinds of people and serve different kinds of audiences. And so if you want to represent the whole of what you stand for and the whole of what you do, and hopefully do it with a little bit of empathy and a little bit of decency, you need to allow for diversity and pluralism and change. And that has to be reflected in the way that you talk about yourselves, in the way you market yourselves. And they did this in lots of different ways, some of which were fairly subtle. I want to talk for a second about their influencer approach. Now, I know we've been talking about influencers over the course of the day. I'm sure most of you have run influencer campaigns or worked around influencer campaigns. So you're not going to be utterly floored or surprised at all by the fact that they had an influencer strategy. I do think, just to take a quick note on the tactics of it, I think they did a couple of smart tactical things that maybe we can learn something from. One thing they did, I think, is really cool is they created communications channels among their influencers. So a famous example of this is something they created called TikTokers for Biden, where they got 200 TikTokers with an 80 million collective fans into an account where they could all message each other, coordinate with each other. You know, the campaign was trying, the whole idea of having an influencer campaign is you're trying not to be too dictatorial, you're trying not to tell them what to say, but you're giving them ways to organize each other and to share ideas with each other so that hopefully there can be an accretive quality to what they're doing rather than everyone just going off into their own corner. Another thing they did that I think is pretty cool is they sourced creative content from the community writ large, not just from people who you would call influencers. There's a sort of famous example, famous in my little world, where they did an open call for videos, got a video that was produced by just some film school professor who didn't have a following and certainly didn't consider himself an influencer, and they loved it. They put it out in the world. They put money behind it. And so all of this, I think, goes to that core question of how do you do influencer work or any marketing work that isn't, inauthentic? And so instead of hiring a Jenner and working on a very carefully manicured post for her, they thought deeply about how to engage the most people with the most collective reach and operationalize that partnership in a way that was going to work for the campaign, work for the influencers themselves, and obviously work well for work well for the voters. But I think the bigger point here, going back to the idea of Joe Biden's sort of consistency over the course of 40 years in public life, is that these kind of tactics work because the underlying perception of Joe Biden is so fixed and so well branded that these kinds of content had credibility to them that sometimes influencer work lacks. I'd actually say that Biden's continuity is what gives him the license to be so flexible in his campaign's marketing approach. You don't see those purples and pinks. You don't see these TikToks and say, that's Joe Biden pandering, what a politician, he's trying to pretend he's something he's not. You sort of get that he's doing something a bit different that emanates from the fact that you know him so well and you know the ways in which he's not going to change. And if you compare that to how you might have felt about the previous Democratic nominee for president, and I'll just say I don't think that we were very fair to her as a country, but nevertheless, when she tried similar kinds of things, it didn't sit the same way because she was she had become sort of branded as, something of a shapeshifter. And so, different kinds of design, different kinds of comic videos, different kinds of influencer approaches just weren't able to convey the core of her in the way that when Biden does it, it strikes you as totally aligned with what he's trying to do and not a pander. And I also think on kind of a side point, this kind of thing doesn't just work on offense. It doesn't just work when you're trying to be creative and reach into TikTok and figure out how you're reaching young voters. It also worked on defense as well. This has been much remarked, but there was an attempt to sort of turn the Biden family relationship with companies in Ukraine into last year's version of the Hillary email scandal, and it simply didn't work. It's something that I wind up saying to my clients all the time. The best crisis management strategy is having actual relationships of trust with your consumers. So now you may find yourself in a crisis where you can't turn back the clock 40 years and do that, but there's nothing quite like it. And I think this is why the attempt to sort of turn Joe Biden into something corrupt just didn't sit with people, because they just don't see him as corrupt. And in a world where everyone is so concerned with misinformation and churn and viral attacks, and what happens if my company finds itself on the other side of a negative misinformation campaign, or some kind of pitchforks at the gate kind of moment on social media, it turns out there's nothing quite like just simply having a long track record of standing for what you stand for and being consistent about that, and meaning what you say. The final point I want to make in the couple of minutes I have left is that this kind of marriage of continuity with flexibility is proving not just to be a great communication strategy, but actually, so far, a pretty nifty governing strategy. Joe Biden is not dominating the discourse, which I think most of us might say, thank God, after the 4 years we've just had. But because people know what he stands for, he doesn't need to. He's just sort of doing the work. And he's managing to squeeze a hugely ambitious agenda under the banner of unity without people even noticing to some degree or objecting to it in the way that a more polarizing president might. So I'm going to quote Ezra Klein here. I won't quote this whole long excerpt. American politics feel quieter with Joe Biden in the White House. Does it ever? It's easy to go days without hearing anything the president has said unless you go looking, but the relative quiet is deceptive. Policy is moving at a breakneck pace. The first weeks of the Biden administration were consumed by a flurry of far-reaching executive orders that reopened America to refugees, rejoined the Paris Climate Accords, killed a Keystone Pipeline, to name just a few. These sorts of things would be presidency-defining accomplishments on their own. The American Rescue Plan is a bolder, more progressive economic package than anything a Democratic president has proposed since LBJ, but it is not, for now, a polarizing package. In other words, I don't want to overstretch the point here, but just in the same way that the Biden brand and the continuity of the Biden brand gave him the space to do those pinks and purples and gradients and the TikToks and the influencer work in a way that was seen as consistent and sensible and authentic, rather than cutting against the core of that brand, it also gives him the space to do something like the American Rescue Plan, a hugely ambitious, extremely progressive piece of legislation that isn't even registering for people as controversial or partisan or divisive. And it's currently got more than 50% support among Republicans. Now, every brand is different. Every politician is different. Not making a lot of news isn't going to work for everybody. You may not have the luxury of working at a company that's been saying the same kind of stuff for 30 or 40 years. I don't want to oversimplify it. But what I do think is going to work for everybody is this core idea that politics, just like marketing, is all about values. It's all about character. It's about the things in us that don't change, but it's brought to life in ways that do change and have to change. And if we can get both sides of that equation right, both the core, fixed, immovable identity and the kind of tactical flexibility to present those values in creative ways, and every day find new ways to make people see how the brand connects to the mission, how the brand actually justifies the mission. We can do a lot more than just win a news cycle or make a viral ad or make a award-winning ad campaign. We can actually use communications as a tool, not to get attention, but to further the underlying mission of the companies and causes we work for, and make sure that we're actually getting the work done that we all set out to do. So with that, I thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Teddy. You gave us some really good insight there. A couple of questions. So you were talking about brands and, the difference between Biden brand and Clinton and, the I would say, how, relatability, sorry, if I can say that your
Yeah,
word. But basically,
good.
how do
Love it.
brands make sure they're connecting in an authentic way and not just to be seen to be jumping on the bandwagon? So, for example, TikTok, how does a brand embrace a new channel and do it in a relatable way rather than be seen as consumers like, okay, we're just doing this because that's where the audience is. What advice or
Yeah.
tips would you give?
Look, I think people understand that channels change and trends change, and they're not going to be overly surprised when a brand jumps onto a new channel or jumps onto a new trend. Now, I do think that it's highly important that you have sort of cultural competency. People talk about cultural competency a lot. If you talk about how you may be communicating to communities of color, how you may be communicating to immigrant communities and things like that. Very, very, very important. But cultural competency applies in lots of different ways. There's a cultural competency to TikTok. If I were running marketing for a big company, I would not deploy anything on TikTok without running it by a bunch of 20 somethings who've been growing up with TikTok and know it a lot better than I probably do at the age that I'm at. And so, I think obviously you need to do it in a culturally competent way. But if you do that, I think people understand that the companies are going to move on to new platforms. They're going to jump on memes. They're going to try to do different stuff. So I think the question is not, so much. Do you or do you not get into TikTok? It's, what is that thing that you stand for? I think like we often see companies, make a total ass of themselves, frankly, when they try to jump on Black History Month, or yesterday was International Women's Day, and companies that have no business talking about that stuff or no actual legacy of working in those fields, or that actually haven't given a dime or don't have good employment practices or whatever, are probably better served just shutting up. But the companies that have actually been working in those spaces for a long time have a story to tell, have diverse executive ranks, have great employment practices, have CSR programs, have good sourcing and procurement and all the other things that make them, sort of credible messengers, can do that kind of thing and have trust and have leeway. And you can't start doing that yesterday and then put out your press release today. It's work that you got to do. So I think, again, everyone's in a different situation. You may not have the luxury of working at a company that can credibly say that it's been doing stuff in a certain space for 10 years or whatever. But that I think is the kind of the litmus test. Is there credibility? Is there honesty? Are you speaking about it in a culturally competent way? And if so, I think you're going to be able to reap the benefits of that. And if not, you're honestly probably better just not saying anything and thinking about how you're going to put yourself in a position where next year or the year after you can speak about one of these issues with a little more credibility.
You made some really good points there because, as you say, it's almost, pick it for a brand. It's picking and choosing the causes that resonate with you as a brand, but authentic to you as a brand, and something that you're kind of living and breathing and doing. Changing the tack slightly. So if you look at messaging, 2016, Trump's messaging was all about change. Biden's messaging was about continuity. Both worked. Very different messages. Why do you think that is?
Well, part of it is just the weird peculiarities of the American political system. I mean, Trump didn't win a plurality of the vote in either election. So I think anyone who lives in America, whether you work in politics or not, has to think very deeply about what it means for us as a country that Trump won and why that could have happened. But I don't want to sort of narrowly buy into this idea that Trump was triumphantly victorious and then Biden was and Hillary was an utter failure because, we just have a sort of a weird electoral system. I think I do think that in most elections, there's, a hunger for change. I think change is generally a pretty good message when it comes to politicians. And you even see incumbents, as they're running for re-election, talk about change because you can't simply run on the idea of continuity. I think Trump sold a particular idea of change that he obviously didn't then govern as. And I don't want to get too political here, and I'm sure there are some Trump supporters in the conference. But he wasn't just talking about change in the abstract. He was actually talking about sort of shaking up the economic powers that be in the country. The forgotten man, the little guy, sort of reestablishing the American dream, all that kind of stuff that has a lot of appeal. And then for his own Trumpy reasons, governed as an utter plutocrat who cut taxes for billionaires and did very little for the little guy that he claimed to run for. I think the appeal of Biden's message, and I know I'm running out of time here, doesn't so much say that continuity or normalcy is a great political message under most times. It's that Trump had exhausted the American people. And there was a sort of a unique hunger in the last election to just move on from this, move on from having to pay attention to the president all day long and see what fights he was picking today. I'm not sure that he'll be running on a message of continuity in 4 years.
Thanks so much, Teddy. I think that's a really good point to end on. It's been a really insightful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.